Thank you all for coming today. My name is Ashley Rogers. I'm the Executive Director of the Whitney Plantation. Almost exactly 1 year ago, southeastern Louisiana was hit by Hurricane Ida, a Category 4 storm. Whitney sustained a direct hit, and we had damage to every building on our site. This church, which was built by freed people in 1870 in Paulina, Louisiana, narrowly escaped destruction. The damage was so severe that the entire roof had to be reframed. All of the insulation sheetrock was pulled out and replaced and repainted. It has been closed to the public until today. Anniversaries are important both for joyful events and for traumatic events, and I did not want the anniversary of Hurricane Ida to pass unnoticed. Thank you all for being here in celebration of how far we have come and in solidarity of concern for our shared future. The reality is that sites like Whitney Plantation will only grow more vulnerable in the coming years to climate change. We have survived this hurricane, but when we installed a new roof on this church with shingles that can last 50 years, I wondered to myself if this site will still be here in 50 years. Earlier this year, we participated in a national survey sponsored by the American Alliance of Museums that was meant to understand what museum audiences think about climate change. Many of our respondents did not understand why Whitney Plantation was concerned with climate change at all, and one comment really stuck in my craw. It is not the business of Whitney Plantation to discuss race or climate. Stick to the subject. When I read that comment, I knew immediately that we had to talk about climate more and louder. And I knew that we must help our audience understand the important intersections between race and climate change. Within an hour of reading that comment, I had conceived of this event. Whitney Plantation's mission is to educate the public about the history and legacies of slavery in the United States. The legacies of slavery are not just economic and social, they are also environmental. Centuries ago, European colonizers forced enslaved Africans to clear-cut forests to build monocrop plantations, altering this delicate wetland landscape forever. This plantation began using fossil fuels in the 1820s, when the owners installed a steam engine from England in the sugar mill to speed up the sugar processing. In the 20th century, plantations adopted pesticides and fertilizers derived from oil and engaged in dangerous ecological practices. In the 1960s, workers at Whitney Plantation regularly witnessed mass fish kills after pesticide planes sprayed the fields overhead where they were working. In the mid-20th century, St. John, St. James, and St. Charles parishes were swallowed up by the rapidly developing petrochemical industry. International companies descended on the river parishes, buying up plantations for the purposes of further extraction on this land. The descendants of enslaved people, still living on and near plantations, became the fence-line communities of this new industrial environment. Once the densest plantation district in the country, today, Cancer Alley, as it is known, is home to over 150 petrochemical and heavy industrial plants. Whitney Plantation sits at the nexus of these overlapping concerns about environmental justice and climate change. The linkages to the history of slavery are glaring and deep. I am thrilled to welcome our speakers today, who will bring diverse perspectives on this topic. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes for you. We will break for lunch at 1 p.m., so if you have pre-registered today, you will have a box lunch here. We're gonna see what happens with the rain. If it's not rainy, we can eat outside on the picnic tables. If it is rainy, we can bring our lunches and eat in here. There are bathrooms also to the left and the right of the stage, and also in the visitor center where you came in. If you need to get up and leave at any point today, our staff will be happy to point you in the right direction. That's Ali, Diamond, and Cheryl here in the back. We also have books by some of our speakers for sale here today, so if you would like to purchase a book, You saw some on the table right when you walked in. You can feel free to do that in the visitor center. They can ring you up in there. And finally, this is the first of a 2-day event. So tomorrow we will host a free webinar from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. And if you're interested in that webinar with different speakers, you can find more information on our website, whitneyplantation.org/seminars. I do need to announce that this event was funded under a grant from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, for which we're very grateful, which is a state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Now I am pleased to bring up our first speaker, Nathaniel Rich. Nathaniel is the author of 2 recent works of nonfiction, Second Nature and Losing Earth. His writing has won awards from the Society of Environmental Journalists and the American Institute of Physics. He is a writer at large for the New York Times Magazine, and he lives in New Orleans. Thank you, Nathaniel, for joining us today.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? I don't have my pedestal here. It's really an honor to be with you all here and to be at Whitney Plantation, a place I just have tremendous admiration for. I want to thank Andrea Rogers and her colleagues for holding this important event, but also for devoting themselves to this mission, to this remarkable institution that in visceral, honest terms tells the story of slavery in America and slavery in Louisiana. And not only does a fantastic job of interpreting the past, but tracing the ways in which we're still haunted by that past, the ghosts of that past today. And I'd be remiss also before beginning not to recognize Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, who just passed away at 93, a scholar who made important, foundational contributions to our understanding of slavery in Louisiana, and I think whose work is in some ways the intellectual foundation of what goes on at Whitney today. Every time I come here, it's just I remark on how crazy it seems that it took this institution to bring a slavery museum to this country. That there was no museum dedicated to slavery until Whitney opened. And I think there's a lesson in that too, that there's not a lesson that often it takes what bureaucracies fail to accomplish, because there have been efforts in the past to try to get some kind of museum off the ground. I've spoken with historians about these efforts, and they always seem to get bogged down in funding issues, political issues, personality issues. But it often takes, a motivated, dedicated group of people to bring something like this off, or even an individual. And I think that's an important lesson to keep in mind in this conversation also about climate and race in Louisiana. So I've been asked to speak about this subject, and it's fascinating to hear what you said, Andrea, about the blowback to this idea that this is somehow foreign to the mission of the place. I don't think you can live in southern Louisiana and not be just constantly enmeshed in themes of race and climate change. It's the fabric of existence here. I felt it every day since I moved here with my wife and now my family 12 years ago on the 5-year anniversary of Katrina. My wife had been hired as a public defender in Orleans Parish, and I was at the time writing a novel called Odds Against Tomorrow that it concerns a hurricane hitting New York City. And I'd written a draft, and as soon as I moved here and lived here for a few months, I realized I had to tear up the final third of the novel, which is essentially about what happens after the devastation of a hurricane. Not because I got any of the sort of technical facts wrong about what it means to live in a place that's been ravaged by a hurricane, but what I didn't quite understand and wasn't quite prepared for, I think, was the way the trauma lives on, and not just that there's trauma, of course we know that, but how it's infused into the fabric of daily life. When I moved to New Orleans, there were still the X codes were on buildings were everywhere. And I realized that trauma is a living thing. It breathes and it grows, especially when it's hidden. There's an excellent documentary I'd recommend to everyone here. Probably many of you have seen the Katrina Babies. That's really about this and about people who have lived with this trauma as young people and now adults, and understand that trauma has its own will to survive. And of course, you can't come to Whitney without being aware of that. I think there's a parallel here also to climate change, which I hope is not too tortured of a comparison, but it's this. Climate change is the after effect of greenhouse gas emissions, right? So it's very hard for people to understand this, at least in a sort of visceral sense. There's a 10 or 20 year lag from when carbon is emitted into the atmosphere and to when it starts having a warming effect on the atmosphere. So it's a kind of environmental trauma, right? It's a planetary trauma. It's the response to what I think at this point in our history we can only interpret as a crime, which is just polluting CO2 into the atmosphere at these astounding levels. And so it's a delayed result, but it's a result that continues to grow. And I think that's important to keep in mind as well. And in the same way that trauma over other issues, it's a kind of physical trauma that persists. So after living here for some time, I found myself drawn increasingly to climate change writing, climate change issues. I talked about the CO2 as a release as a crime, and I wanted, it's this crime to which we're all victims, and I wanted to understand, well, who did this, and how are we all implicated in it? How are we victimized? And of course, who's victimized more than other people? And so I wrote a book called Losing Earth, which explores this question. And the story, I found out, to my surprise, went back much longer than I realized. Does anyone know when we started to understand the basic fundamental science of climate change? Any guesses? The basic understanding that increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere makes the world warmer is older than the Civil War. That goes back to Eunice Foote, female scientist from Connecticut, in 1856, first conducted experiments that showed carbon dioxide traps heat. Irish physicist named John Tyndall did similar experiments in the 1860s and publicized his findings more widely, and he gets more credit, basically, I think, because he was a male prominent figure and Eunice Foote was not. And by the turn of the century, by 1898, a Swedish chemist and a future Nobel laureate named Svante Arrhenius realized that human beings, by burning coal, were putting a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, that they were so much carbon dioxide that it was dramatically altering the composition of the atmosphere. I think for people who are just coming in, there's some seats up front if you would like to come. But Arrhenius was not so concerned, right? Because he lived in Sweden, where it was really cold, and he figured, well, okay, if it gets a little warmer, great, we'll be less cold in the wintertime. Then there was Guy Stewart Callender, who's an English steam engineer in the 1930s. He built on Arrhenius's findings by saying that not only was there more coal in the atmosphere, but there's so much more coal going into the atmosphere than even Arrhenius realized. Again, not concerned. He lived in England. If things got a little warmer, that would be fine. The first concern about climate change comes in the 1950s in this country by a prominent scientist named Roger Revelle, who was an advisor to presidents, beginning with Kennedy. And his critical understanding was not only that there's even more carbon dioxide going in the atmosphere than these predecessors understood, but he understood the way in which climate and human society were linked. That it's not just about weather, And I think this is something that also, certainly our politicians still struggle to understand. And I think it's also related to the critical insight that this symposium will examine. It's not just about warmth, it's about every aspect of society. Where we built our cities, how we trade, where our ports are, the relationships between foreign governments, the global economy, is all founded on a basic premise, which is that the climate that we've had, that we've known forever, will continue as it is forever. And of course, we now know that's not true. And in 1957, Roger Revelle started warning about this. He started talking about floods in Manhattan. He started talking about infrastructure will be challenged. He started talking about foreign relationships between countries will be challenged as the basic resources and the mix of resources in the planet are shifting. There was an article on the front page of the New York Times about this. There were children's programs about this. This is the late 1950s. It was not a secret. Okay, Time Life ran a big special about it, where they warned about flooding of major American cities. And the next year, Roger Revelle helped to found what is to this day the major carbon dioxide monitoring program in Hawaii, in Mauna Loa, which measures daily the CO2 in the atmosphere. And it's a continuous reading that we can chart all the way back to 1957. So if you ever see those charts of CO2 in the atmosphere, it comes from this one experiment on this mountain, on the volcano in Hawaii. Revelle was also the person who identified what's perhaps the greatest challenge of the problem, at least politically, which is the delay between the injury and the trauma that it causes, the damage that it causes. I spoke about this 10, 20-year lag, but of course the trauma only increases over time. It's cumulative. And so you have this situation where the warming we experience now that affects storms in the Gulf, that affects sea level rise and all the rest of it, is warming that was caused by people who came before us, just as the warming that we're contributing to by using gas cars or basically living in modern society using energy will be borne by people, well, us when we're older, and then generations that come beyond that. And the time frame of climate change is just deeply unsuited to our political structure, where people are voted into office for 2 years or 4 years or 6 years. And so there's this constant incompatibility there that we're always striving and for the most part failing to navigate. So I spent 4 years immersed in this history to write a book called Losing Earth, and I ended up not focusing on the scientific story of how we came to an understanding of climate change. What was more interesting to me was why, once we understood it, did we fail to fix it? And does anyone know when there was, we hear now about scientific consensus over climate change, that 99.9% of scientists agree on the fundamental science of climate change. Do you know when that consensus dates from? Anyone have guesses? 15 years ago? That's a good guess. Anyone else? Okay, I'll tell you. 1979, okay, before I was born. 1979, there was a series, get into the details in the book, but basically there's a series of major governmental scientific meetings, papers, and so on, that crystallized what is now is unchanged as the science of climate change, which is essentially what causes climate change, what we should expect in the decades that come, and what kind of solutions are necessary. The main solution is sort of obvious and easy to state, which is reduce greenhouse gas emissions, stop burning oil, gas, predominantly. Of course, it's implementing that solution that's, our challenge. So it's in 1979 that attention moved from the science to politics, right? It's also, in other words, how do we fix this? And this is going on at the highest levels of the government. It was also a time before the oil and gas industry had consolidated behind a strategy of disinformation, political bribery, and ultimately manufacturing the fantasy of climate denialism. And it was a decade when major figures from both parties, as astonishing as this is to contemplate now, made a major push for action. And so, in other words, it was a time before not only our current political paralysis had taken hold, but before the public conversation had undergone its own form of paralysis. In the end, I decided to focus on the one figure during this period who most pushed the narrative forward and tried to bring about a real change, tried to bring about solutions. And he was a guy named Rafe Pomerantz, who's still alive today. He was a lobbyist then for Friends of the Earth, an environmental group. And he can be considered not only the first climate activist in this country, but really the only one for the first decade of this history. And he teamed up with a CIA scientist, one of the leading scientists within the intelligence agencies, to organize briefings across the highest levels of the federal government. And not only the intelligence community, but it went all the way to the office of the White House, and to Jimmy Carter, who was then in office. And he basically responded the way I think this feels like the intuitive way that most of us would respond, which is to say, he learned that there was this problem. CO2 going into the atmosphere was threatening to derange civilization. And he told everyone in power about it, right? He went to and he had access to do so. He was highly placed within the administration, right? Connections within the administration. And they told everybody. And he thought, well, surely if we tell people what's going on, out of some sense of prudence and common sense, they will begin taking some action. And in the Carter administration, he had people who were willing to listen to him. And it didn't work. And so the next step, and then of course Reagan comes in and the political calculation changes. The next step was, as the decade continued, was he thought, well, okay, we need to go to the public and we need to tell the world about that this was happening. And so he did so, and with the help of James Hansen, a NASA scientist, they gave press conferences, they gave congressional hearings, there were newspaper articles in all the major publications in the country, and yet the ball didn't move things sufficiently to even have any legislation drafted. And by the end of the decade, as the projections were becoming more and more dire, and you have James Hansen testifying in front of Congress saying that not only will the world get warmer, it's already demonstrably warmer because of climate change. This is 1988. This was a hearing before the Senate that became in front of every newspaper, became international news, and made Hansen a kind of the global face of climate change. And at that point, you start to see some movement, and you start to have a kind of third phase of this argument, which is to shame political leaders for not taking action. Of course, you still see this today, but this is 1988, 89, saying, if you don't act, that we will be in tremendous trouble and you will be blamed. And so the culmination of this is the beginning of the IPCC process, which is still with us today, which is where they meet every few years and have a new global agreement that every year, every iteration becomes sort of more and more toothless. But in 1989, they had on the table a global agreement, a draft of a global agreement designed to reduce global warming, to phase out carbon emissions. And every country in the world at one point was on board with signing it. It was modeled after the successful ozone treaty of 1987. You even had Ronald Reagan's head of his EPA saying, after we sign the ozone treaty, we're going to sign the global warming treaty. You have George H.W. Bush campaigning on the issue, saying that those who think that we can't solve the greenhouse effect haven't heard about the White House effect. And when I'm in office, we're going to solve it. And this culminates with this dramatic, high-level diplomatic meeting in 1989 in the Netherlands, which is the first time that basically pen will be put to paper to sign this thing. And what happens? It falls apart. The U.S. pulls out. The U.S., which has been leading the negotiations, pulls out. And the story of why that happens is one that's full of political intrigue and personalities, and it's just basically a fight between factions within the Bush White House, between the EPA and the head of the EPA and the chief of staff for Bush, John Sununu. And that's a fascinating story, but it only really tells a part of it. The other part of it is really why, it begs the question of why did it take one person within the Bush administration to derail what was then a global effort to fix this problem? And of course, right after that meeting falls apart, the process basically dissolves, and at the same time, the oil and gas industry settles in a series of white papers, which I found in my research that hadn't been reported on. They actually lay out what's going to be a strategy to stop climate policy, a strategy of essentially paying off scientists to write editorials for them, to challenge the science, to attack scientists, and all the rest of the kind of obfuscation and this sort of treachery that we've seen from that industry ever since. And so what's the lesson to be learned from that? And so to conclude, we haven't been as close to a global agreement since then. Okay, 1989, that's where the book basically ends. And so we haven't had any real climate policy in this country either since then, until the Inflation Reduction Act passed by Biden a few weeks ago, is really the first and really the only major climate legislation that's been passed since then. It's also worth mentioning that in 1989, as this global process was going on in Congress, there were two massive, there were 32 climate bills introduced, but led by two, one by a Democratic Senator, Timothy Worth from Colorado, and one by a Republican representative from Rhode Island, from a branch of the Republican Party that essentially doesn't exist anymore, that were omnibus climate bills that had massive support, 40 sponsors in the House and Senate, that were more ambitious than even what you see today. That's what's called the Green New Deal, right? It went even further than that, and these were bipartisan bills. So that's where we were then, to understand how the situation has degraded to this point. And so, why did this happen? Why did this fail? And why, once the Bush administration failed on the issue, why did we not get closer ever since? I think a big part of it has to do with the fact that climate change didn't have a lot of juice, right? It was an issue that at the time, 1988, 89, had very broad support. If you look at public opinion polls then, something like 65, 68% of Americans, 1988, 89, said we should do something about climate change. However, the support, as broad as it was, wasn't deep. In the same public opinion polls, climate ranks at the bottom of issues, maybe 18th, 19th on those lists, well behind, basically any other political issue you can think of. And the activists at the time, their argument was pretty simple, and it was in some ways undebatable. It was simply that we know what's going to happen if we fail to act, and we need to act before it's too late. It was essentially an appeal to reason. We know what we need to do. We know we have to act. We'll be stupid not to act. And it's essentially the same argument that persisted for the next 30 years in an increasingly high pitch. We know what's wrong. We know, this is Al Gore, Inconvenient Truth. Here's some charts. Can't you see what's going on? We need to act. And I think what the climate activists started to understand is a lesson that civil rights activists had understood for decades, which is that it's not enough to make an appeal to reason. It's not enough to say, this is the smart thing to do, right? We'd be stupid not to do this. That's not the whole picture. At least it doesn't create the kind of political movement necessary to force politicians to act. And if you don't force a politician to act, guess what? They're not going to act. When popular movements have managed to transform public opinion in a brief amount of time, forcing the passage of major legislation, they've done so on the strength of a moral claim that persuades enough people to see the issue in human and not just political terms, right? So the first responsibility is to speak about the problem honestly as a struggle for survival, right? It's not just about what's smart, it's about what we need to do to survive, and the transformations necessary to end our dependence on fossil fuels will require such a shift in consciousness. But that change has begun. In the last few years, young activists and community leaders demanding action on climate have increasingly spoken in a moral register. And that means they're speaking more personally, right? So instead of saying things like we'd be stupid not to act, they're saying we're angry at the cowardice of our leaders, our lives are at stake. And this moral understanding, this moral language rests on the understanding that climate change doesn't harm us all equally, right? The great perversity of climate change is that those who are most responsible for bringing us to this point will get off the easiest, at least in the short term. The more marginalized you are, the worse you will suffer. And this cuts on just about every form of inequality in society. It certainly cuts on racial lines. It cuts on economic lines. It cuts on gender lines even. And so I wanted to understand, one thing I wanted to understand was, where did this moral language come from? Right? It didn't start, you start hearing it in the popular press here in 2018, after that election, when you have sit-ins in Pelosi's office, and you have Greta Thunberg and that kind of sunrise movement. But when I went back, I realized that actually this kind of logic came from people of color, people in the third world who had been talking about climate and these issues back to the 1980s. So at the conference in the Netherlands that I referred to before, there's a small island nation called Kiribati that's essentially just like a straight line in the middle of the ocean. And at that conference, there was the prime minister, the environmental minister from Kiribati said, climate is not just a political issue, it's not just a scientific issue. If the water goes up a foot or two, it'll come up to my ankle, If it goes up another few feet, it'll come up to my waist, right? He spoke about it in personal terms that at the time, I think was taken almost as amusing by the other ministers, but he was putting it into individual, personalized terms. And you see this continued, especially from people from these island nations. In 2014, the Prime Minister of the Seychelles at the IPCC meeting, when they were watering down their proposals even further, he said, "We cannot accept that any island be lost to sea level rise. We do not have the economic means to build sophisticated defenses, nor do we have the economic might to apply sanctions on those most guilty of causing the problem. But we have something that's invaluable, something that is powerful. We're the conscience of these negotiations. We stand as the defenders of the moral rights of every citizen of our planet." A year later, the foreign minister from the Marshall Islands said that the islanders' forced abandonment of their homes and cultures is, quote, "equivalent in our minds to genocide." So you don't have to live on a remote island nation to understand these dynamics, right? You see it here in southern Louisiana every day. You see it at, famously now, globally famous in Ile de Jean Charles, which I think is the first forced climate migration in the world. You see it in Jackson, right? What's going on there? And you see it next door, here in Wallace. There's a funny way in which environmental problems, climate problems, tend to have a tendency to play out at places where there are civil rights problems, right? It's not a coincidence. And Ashley pointed to that before. This drew me to write, in my last book, Second Nature, I wrote about Ironton. Is there anyone from Ironton here, by any chance? No, before I embarrass myself. But Ironton is a community across the river, the site of the former Ironton Plantation. After emancipation, enslaved people there gained ownership of the land, and their descendants remain there to this day, 5 generations later. But every generation has had to fight to stay. As late as 1980, in Plaquemines Parish, they had segregated hospital waiting rooms. public parks, and even hurricane evacuation plans, right? So white people could take shelter at a local school, while black people had to seek refuge at a Navy station 17 miles away. And Ironton always had it worst of all. The council, the Plaquemines Council refused to provide them with running water or a sewer system until 1981, after a series of national articles brought light to the issue. And it won't surprise anyone here that Plaquemines Parish in the state of Louisiana has invited major industry to settle basically all around Ironton. And as Ashley said, much of the major industry in southern Louisiana occupies the sites of former plantations. For years, Ironton has been choked by coal from a coal terminal nearby and grain from a grain elevator. But it's also the site of where the state plans to build a major diversion of the Mississippi River, which is part of the master plan. And probably many of you are familiar with the master plan, perhaps. It's essentially the most ambitious climate infrastructure plan in the world. It's happening here in southern Louisiana. 50-year plan, $50 billion to rebuild the swamps, the wetlands south of here. You might not know it in those terms because no one in Louisiana politics describes it as a climate plan, but that's what it is. And so where do they want to build one diversion? It's basically right next to Ironton. So not only does Ironton have to deal with the brunt of the pollution and the damage that's been done, but when it comes time to fix the problem, they're also on the front lines of having to deal with the challenges of that. It's not so easy to be next to a giant diversion in the river, which essentially is a new river built coming out of a tributary from the Mississippi that would itself be one of the biggest rivers in the country once it starts going. And so this is a classic Louisiana story. You have this nexus of trauma, development, repair, and it tends to be the same communities that have to suffer at every step of the way. So you cannot separate these issues, right? It's not a coincidence that the people who own plantations selling out to major industry. It's not a coincidence that the people living on these land, the descendants of enslaved people, are those whose fundamental rights to clean air and clean water are under assault. So there's another case that I won't go into, but you even have, like in St. James, there's this fight now about solar panels and solar farms. Again, it's a question of a prudent policy, but even prudent policies require some people locally to suffer. It's not a reason not to do the policies, but of course, you have a community there that's been beset by industrial pollution and now has to confront major new industry, clean industry, but they're the ones who have to deal with it. And so the good news, the surprising news is that, as I said, this has really started to shift, and you see it here in southern Louisiana as much as anywhere, where no longer are the activists involved locally making purely an appeal to reason, right? Locally and globally, they're appealing to a sense of morality. They've taken these lessons from the civil rights movement, and they've learned that climate movement is a civil rights movement. That's a major shift, and that's something that we've only seen in the last few years. And we're already seeing effects. And I suspect this is something we'll hear about more from the folks who will follow me today. And I want to end just with this idea of New Orleans and southern Louisiana, is a place that is always associated with the past. Of course, you feel it on a site of a former plantation. You feel it in New Orleans in these historic neighborhoods. So there's a good reason for that, right? Ghosts are alive here. There's a sense of a haunting here as well. But what I think people, especially outside of this community, don't understand is it's also the future, right? We're living now in this place that's experiencing what the rest of the world will experience in the coming years and decades. And how we navigate these problems in these years ahead, especially if we do it well, whether it's with the master plan and efforts to rebuild what's been lost, the shift away from oil and gas towards renewable energy, the rallying of local communities to block powerful corporations from poisoning their land and their air and their water. We can create a model for how to face up to these challenges. So, the rest of the world is watching what's going on here, both, politically, industrially, and culturally. So I encourage everyone here not only to listen to what the following speakers have to say, but to participate in the conversation as well, what you're doing by all coming out here. It's really exciting to see, not only this weekend, but in the days and the weeks that follow. We're writing our future here right now, and we're doing it together. And so I'm excited to be part of that with all of you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. We're going to do a bit of a scene change. And we're going to host a conversation with some St. John the Baptist Parish community activists. So we're going to bring that conversation a little more to what that means on the ground here, what's happening in our own community with regards to environmental racism, environmental justice, and climate change. So this would be a good time if you need to get another glass of water, a cup of coffee, go to the bathroom, and I'm going to have my staff come up here and we're going to move some stuff around. We're going to move this table and bring our next speakers up. I am so happy to be joined here today by some wonderful community activists here from St. John the Baptist Parish who are doing some really critical work to fight industry and fight for environmental justice here in St. John Parish. So we have here with us today Joy and Joe Banner, who are co-founders of the Descendants project, based right here in Wallace, right next to our plantation. And we also have Bobby Taylor, who is the founder of Concerned Citizens of St. John the Baptist Parish from just across the river in Reserve. So thank you so much, Bobby Taylor. And I'm going to be just guiding us in a conversation, and so as we go, if you want to throw in some little facts about who, I'll ask a little bit, but you can throw in some information about who you are and kind of how you came to this. But the way that I'd like to start off this conversation is just, the name that we have for this stretch of the river, what we call it is Cancer Alley. And what we talk about a lot is we talk about the problems that happen here in the river parishes. And there's so much that people who are not from this area hear about in a really negative light about what this place is like. And, I have worked here now for 8 years, and I think I have a different perspective, and I know all of y'all have a different perspective too. So I'd like to start just by asking, what do you love about where you're from?
Thanks, Ashley. That's a great question to start with. What I love about this area is the rootedness that I feel to it, and just so much culture and heritage. It's so rich with these traditions that come from all different parts of the world. They've converged here to make this place wonderful, beautiful, mysterious, interesting, weird, but it's my home. So just this feeling of home and being so connected to my ancestors is something that will always make this place beautiful for me. What I love the most, I think, about this community is that despite all of the industry and the challenges, that it is very peaceful and quiet and calming. There's a connection to the land, there's a connection to our community, and it comes like what Joe was saying, our family has been here for 300 years, and I think it's that sense of belonging and space and place that is just, we see it everywhere. It's the way that the sun rises, it's the way that the sun sets. It's the bald eagles that that we've named, and we keep track of them. We know their favorite trees. So I just don't think we're so busy all the time that we very rarely do you have those chances to appreciate and understand the environment around you. And again, this is with everything, all of the challenges that we have. So yeah, I literally love the atmosphere around here, and if I would find a house somewhere, I would still never find a home like this one. And so this is why I came back, and this is why I intend, and we will be here. We will fight to be here for as long as we can, and for future generations.
Thanks. Well, that's a question that's really complicated. I'm just finding that out. I've been here quite a while, especially compared to these babies. And the things that I thought that I really loved about this place, they've talked about them and they're real. Even more so, I fell more in love with our culture as I began to travel. And this last trip that we went on, it really made me realize what home is like and the uniqueness of our culture here that I really love. So I'm afraid to say, because it may change as I'm finding out more and more stuff about the greatness of our culture. You know, not only is it is unique, because I certainly couldn't find any comfort, but that's another story. But it's so great. Our culture, our people, the way we live is just, this right here is a part of it. You know, when I think about this building, I was amazed that this building was floated from upriver from one of our old communities up there. So we are just blessed here with a unique culture and peoples that I'm proud to be a part of. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. I think it's important to hear it from people who are from here, because, you know, oftentimes in these conversations about the petrochemical industries coming in, people will say, well, why don't you just move, you know? And that completely ignores the value of this culture and the value of the people who are here and the value of the environment here and people's connections to their ancestors. I'm curious how St. John Parish is different now than when you were growing up. What are the main things that you see as being different today than they were when you were younger?
Wow, yeah. Yeah, well, I heard the first speaker up, you know, and when he told me his birth date, I was 39 years old. I was 40 years old. I've been here a minute. Yeah, so long sometime that my thoughts waver. What was I supposed to be answering now?
How is St. John different now?
Oh, God, yeah. Well, of course, I was born in Reserve right across the river in 1940. So I grew up in an agrarian society, the economy. It was sugarcane, you know. I played in the sugarcane fields. Up until 1955, I was 15 when it changed, you know. And that's really what I really missed, what we had then. It wasn't the greatest in the world, but we weren't so fragrantly poisoned. I mean, the way they are killing our people now, and I just heard somebody mention the term Cancer Alley, that it's accepted. And I found out, I found out the first time I heard the word Cancer Alley, really, was in Los Angeles, California. I was talking to people and they said, man, you talk something funny, where you from? And when I told them where I was from, one of the people that jumped up and said, man, you're from Cancer Alley. And I said, what? Yeah, and that wasn't that long ago. And then about 2 years ago, I was shocked to find out about another horrible thing that I've grown up with here and didn't know. I found out about the sacrifice zone. I found out that I live in an area and with a people who have been designated sacrificial lambs. That's an acceptable term and practice. We are among those people that are being sacrificed at the altar of the petrochemical industry and other giant, rich, and powerful people who we don't know or have any control over. But when I found out that we actually live in a place that's been designated sacrificial, in Cancer Alley, the majority of people black people are 92% of the victims in Cancer Alley. If we go up and down the river parishes, from Iberville Parish down to St. Charles, the population that live here, where I live, in the community in Reserve, DuPont Dinker was dumped on us in 69. That was new to us. The people in Reserve didn't know anything about DuPont Dinker, and I misconstrued the white flight for the civil rights movement, you know. And I didn't realize that those people were moving because they knew DuPont was coming. So what that resulted in, there's only one white family that lives in Census Tract 108. One white family. So everybody within those zones that are the closest and the most affected by the effects of DuPont Dinker, it's 99.9% black folk. That school that got me started when I thought how I did to found this organization is when EPA came in June of 16 and told us, it gave us the results of the test and showed us that those children, 500 or 600 children in that elementary school, were being poisoned at a rate 400 to 700 times what EPA said was a safe level. I did not believe that that could happen in America today. From first grade to fifth grade, they transport black children from all over St. John Parish to what was originally the only black high school. That's where I went to high school. It is now an elementary school, and it's 99% black. DuPont sat right on top of them. The school was not put there. DuPont came into this community, and they are poisoning the community as a whole. But to think that they are allowed, EPA set up safe, what they considered a safe level, which we know now there is no such thing, for chloroprene. We know that there is no level of chloroprene that a human being can be subjected to. But DuPont has been able to get the government of the United States to go from their original zero, it was 0.002. DuPont was able to bullet them or whatever, however they control it, and they raised it to 0.02. 0.2. God. Oh. And here we sit today. I discovered that, well, the government warned us, say your children are being exposed at 400 times what we consider a safe level. And that's when this movement started. And we have fought these people consistently now for 6 years. And what has happened? DuPont in our face has increased 20% of what they were doing in 2016. They didn't reduce it. We couldn't get the local government, state, or anybody to try and rescue let's at least move the children out to the perimeters where they only exposed 5 times. See, but there's no safe place in St. John the Baptist Parish. When I say safe, I'm talking about what EPA has designated. That's where DuPont is keeping it below 0.2. No place in the parish we could go to get that. But to sacrifice those children, and not to this day, they have not done anything to help those children. And DuPont has belligerently increased the amount of chloroprene, which is only one of 29 horrible chemicals we know nothing about, that our government allows that plant to dump into our community. So our children are at risk. They did not have to deal with, we didn't have that risk from the sugarcane industry. But the petrochemical industry brought about a serious, catastrophic change. Cancer rates, it's just so bad. I get so emotionally involved with this because I am so involved in it. I've been here all my life. My mother died of cancer, my brother, my sister. I got a 35-year-old nephew that's just come up with 4-stage cancer. It's so terrible here, and I don't know how it's being played. The power of the petrochemical industry, the grip that they have on the government and therefore the people. I heard this guy, the speaker up before, talk about it, and I think back in history on it, on how industry has always trumped over the people, continues to, and I probably could have wound on, but let me please share this mic with this lady.
Well, and so when me and Joe were growing up, industry was already there. We were born in 1978. I'll tell y'all my age so y'all can get the context of what I'm talking about. Okay. So Joe and I, we grew up with Kaiser, what it was called at the time, and I think it's the first petrochemical facility that is in this region. And Kaiser is now Atlantic Alumina. It's a bauxite producing plant. And so its residue is there's a black dust that goes into the production, there's a red dust that's produced, I think there's a white dust. And so the red dust, when the wind blows from the north direction, it comes and red dust is everywhere. It's on our cars, it's on our houses, it's in our clothes, on your shoes. If you have white shoes, we learned very, very quickly, do not purchase white shoes. So we've grown up with industry. We've also grown up when there have been chemical spills, where there have been chemical releases, where we've had to go to the doctors because I think there was a barge that was passing by and there was a chemical that was released there. We've also grown up when alarms have gone off, the alarms that they test on a weekly basis. And you know the days that those alarms are tested, because if there's a day that's not on those test days, you know to start running. I don't know where to run, start by running inside, but you might have to literally evacuate the town in order for you to be safe. So I say that we've always had this presence of industry. And now I'm looking back and realizing that it's not normal, right, to hear plants exploding. It's not normal, to have to hear a chemical release and hear an alarm and run inside. And so the level of danger that we are accustomed to, and our parents were in industry, it's not normal. I think the good part about it, though, is that at least for this stretch of the river, and for 11 miles or so, we've been able to fight off industry from coming in and inundating this area. And so 30 years ago, the Formosa plant that you are all familiar with in St. James is trying to locate, they came to St. John the Baptist Parish first. That same 1,700 acres of land that now the grain terminal is trying to come and set up shop there, that's a result of zoning that was done for Formosa. But a parish president at the time went to jail for taking a bribe, went to federal prison, and the zoning stayed the same. And so it allowed Formosa to continue on into St. James. It allowed Greenfield to come and terrorize us now and traumatize us now. But again, we have been able to fight industry. And there's about 4 or 5 battles in the last 10 or so years, 10, 15 years, where small communities along the river have said no more, right? And so, yeah, I know I'm kind of, tangential to the question, but, we are seeing a change. We're seeing less, we're seeing more people move out, but we're also seeing more people who want to come and who want to move to our communities, especially after the pandemic, especially with technology and all, and being able to work from home. So our communities are attractive, but because of the politicians and all, and because of the power structures, our communities are being depicted and characterized as sacrifice zones and places with no development, so you don't want to come here. And we are constantly having to fight that message.
Thank you both so much. So all of you are representing organizations that you founded, and you've spoken about this monumental fight against these large corporations that are very much involved in the government, kind of have a chokehold on the government. I wonder if you could speak briefly about what made you decide to start your own organization, what your missions are, and maybe just something about that process. I think one of the things that's so interesting here in the river parishes is that we do have these kind of grassroots organizations that are pulling out these tremendous, huge fights against people with a lot more resources and manpower. So maybe you could speak to that.
Sure. For our organization, really started out of tourism and being a part of that industry in a way, like Joy and I have, I think over 20 years experience in tourism in Louisiana. In this area, that's plantation tourism. But being in that space, it made me realize the different, like how my ancestors were being treated, and seeing how, first of all, tourism was a good way to understand the systems of Louisiana, because the Tourist Commission that we have in our area is set up as a political subdivision. That is a very powerful agency entity. A lot of money flows through tourism offices, even if they're not set up as political subdivisions. There's a lot of politics that are involved in tourism, and also how we define ourselves. What's acceptable, what's palatable to people. So if you want to look at kind of a microcosm of what's going on, you can look at tourism, seeing what's included and also see what's being left out. And being in that space of tourism, I started to understand more about who I was, my identity, and getting in touch with my enslaved ancestors, and also seeing how so many tourism offices were leaving that part of the history out. The enslaved people were only mentioned as they intertwined with the slave-owning families. And even if they did mention that, that enslaved person, they would make sure that person was magical, quote, magical. I won't use the other part of that term, but I think some of y'all get it. So it was someone, enslaved person, who was educated in Europe, and they made this invention. They always had to prove their worth to exist. That was the only way they would make it into the histories that I was promoting as being part of the tourism industry. So enough was enough for me. I saw that we, as the ancestors for the enslaved, were not getting the same type of contribution, weren't able to provide the same contribution, weren't able to shape our own stories. We're being left out, even the economy of tourism, which is so critical. We're in, as we've said before, we're in Cancer Alley. We need another industry that gets us away from heavy industry or things that are killing us. And tourism is a beautiful way to do that when it's done correctly, when it's not exploiting us emotionally, when it's not tearing us down or not giving us fair space in our own history. So that just being in that system for so long and being so frustrated about it was one of the reasons why I was like, I can't do it anymore. I just got to a point where I need to start speaking up for my ancestors and speaking up for myself. So it intertwined beautifully for me. I also looked at what descendants have to face, what they're facing as far as their past, but also looking at the present and the future and seeing how we do not have fair say in how we get to live our lives. So that's just a roundabout way of saying how it got started, but I'll pass it on. And I'll just, and I'll just briefly add to that, I kept getting in trouble here at Whitney. So I'm the director of, as of Friday was my last day as a director of communications here at Whitney, 6 years. So yeah, this is, it's sad, but I'm also, we'll be working in partnership. So there's a part of me that feels like, you know, I'm in denial that I'm leaving this place. Okay, that's the reality. But I say that because just to touch on what Joe was saying about the tourism and how complicated and how intertwined and the pressure that's on Whitney to stand by its mission, but then also being pressured by other players in the tourism space to play along with everyone. And for someone that was living here, also representing Whitney, and then also being a community member that's living with the legacies of slavery, it got crunchy. I mean, it was hard to negotiate. It was controversial, you know, and it jeopardized my career here. I'll be honest with you. And it's not that anybody was wrong, but Whitney had his mission for this history, and I realized that there's so much work to be done. Whitney cannot be the only organization that's doing all the work. And so we needed to have another organization that could be out there, you know, fighting for the descendant community, being there, taking the risk, you know, protesting on the side of the levee, you know, being there as a voice of the descendants, and then where Whitney could have, you know, this mission to educate people about slavery. So that's how the Descendants Project is really important to have that base, but then also to speak on behalf of the descendant community that's still living here on the grounds where their ancestors, or in the region where their ancestors were enslaved.
Okay, as I previously stated, how motivated I was. What really drove me was when I realized that there was no one I could go to. There was nothing, there was no organization, and I had no support at all from the government when I went to the school, because the first place I went when I found out the information, well, I ran to the school itself. I was desperate. I can walk to the school from where I live. And they wouldn't talk to me. The principal wouldn't even let me in when I told them what I wanted. So then I called my school board member, and I tried, and nobody knew anything. Nobody wanted to talk about it. You know, here they're poisoning our children at such an, and nobody wants to talk about it. So I knew then that we needed to do something. I looked around. There was no organization coming from the people or from the government. So then I knew then that I needed to do something. So I started to contact the important people. I thought that we could, you know, come together and put this organization together, which we did. And we've been here now for 6 years.
I've heard it said, and I haven't seen citations on it, but I've heard it said that St. John the Baptist Parish is the most polluted parish in Louisiana, and one of the most polluted counties in the nation. And I'm curious, in your opinion, why do you think there is so much petrochemical activity here in St. John Parish?
I think that it is a combination of the geography. From what I hear is that the points in the river, there's a certain depth that's needed. And so I think that this portion of the river, that contributes to it. But I also think too, it's the way that St. John the Baptist Parish sits in the river parishes, and its relation between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, we're in the middle. And I somehow feel like we're getting the politics from both ends of it. We're getting it from Baton Rouge, and we're getting the power structure from New Orleans. And so I think that has a lot to do with it. I know for this side of the river, I think we get targeted because we are agriculturally based, and we appreciate the fact that we are rural. And I think there is a class issue that's going on there. Like, we get targeted. Like, if you are not developed, if you don't have, modern businesses, or what they call, and I say this as a former business professor who loves business, who loves economic development, but who also realizes too that as a business student and then as a business professor, I was taught that the purpose of business is to maximize shareholders' value, right? And then to follow up that career with working at a plantation and then understanding, wow, this economic system, this economic development and labor and jobs, that is the same narrative, that's the same strategy that they were using during slavery times. So I do feel that our past and the way that our plantations are marketed and the way that they are uplifted as these bastions of success, even in the present, still the sugar barons and all, that still is what is targeting us, targeting us now. And I think, Ashley, too, you had made a great point about this. When we talk about industry, people think that industry started with petrochemical. Industry started with the sugar cane, right? And just like these chemicals all along our river are foreign, sugar cane is from Papua New Guinea. The massive destruction, millions of acres, of woodland had to be destroyed in order to grow this crop. It's not supposed to be grown here. And then after the labor, then you have the pesticides, you have the fertilizers. And so it's entrenched in and unfortunately in the DNA that's in this country's development, in this area's development, that we are really just repeating a system that's been there. Maybe we haven't recognized it, but it's always been there. And now we are more aware, and we are starting to fight back more.
I think the primary, the prerequisites for any sort of, especially international businesses, is to have transportation and access to the world. In the river parishes, St. John the Baptist Parish is more strategically located than any other parishes. We have 3 major interstate highways. We got Interstate 10, Interstate 55, and we got the 49 corridor from the West Bank. Of course, the Mississippi River. And we have, I know on the East Bank, we've got 4 railways. I don't know how many you guys got. I know one. So yeah, no other parish has all of these things that industry needed. And the other key industry requirement, the other key things that I find that's attractive to them, why they refer to us as the low-hanging fruit, the people are not organized to protect themselves. The people, as has been proven in the last at least 6 years of my struggle here, that's why they consider us the low-hanging fruit. The 92% of victims here are the least organized politically, educationally, so whatever it takes, because we have as yet not actually exercised our power and the advantages. St. John the Baptist Parish, another thing is, it's a majority black parish. And at the bottom of everything in this parish, in this country that is based on majority rule, although we are the majority here, we rule nothing here. Nothing. Economically, we are 0. Economic development in the black community is out of the window. There is none. So that's why DuPont Dinker was able to come in and tell the state of Louisiana, they came from wherever they came from to this community here, to tell them that it was a good place for them to put that horrible plant, because that community had nothing. I think on their application it says a few cow pastures or something like that. You know what I'm saying? Now that, what was, to me, we noticed construction started on that plant in 1963. To me, it's important because that's the year I got married. And we were looking at, we knew it, and speaking to the fact that our people are just not involved. That's what I'm trying to say. And I'm hoping that I can get that point out, and that it's time for us as a people, if we're gonna overthrow this kind of tyranny, we have to come together as a people. We have to choose our own elected officials. See, we've been lulled and tricked and through terms like ossification and other tricks that they use to think that, you just got to vote. Make sure you go. No, that's not what this government is based on. We have to select our representatives. See, the reason St. John the Baptist Parish is still ruled by the minority is because the minority determines who gets elected, who gets to run for election. They select our candidates, and they select candidates who in the end are going to support them. And that is evident. All we got to do is look at the history of what has taken place here. I suffered at the hands of that myself. I elected this guy to represent me from the 3rd District. And when I started this fight against DuPont, he became my #1 enemy. He allowed the DEQ to come into our community. When we fought and demanded something, they had to get the head of DEQ to come here. That's his job, right? To protect us, Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. So when the community found out that we were dying at these unprecedented rates and how they were killing our future with those children, we stood up. So they called the top guy, Mr. Chuck Carl Brown, to the city council, which is being televised to the whole community. And when Mr. Brown, who's heading a state organization to protect us from industry, when he stood up, the first thing he did was turn around and point to me. I could have fell out. He said, this guy here, Robert Taylor, I want to warn y'all. He's talking, here's this council that we elected. He's talking to them, and he said he's a troublemaker and a fearmonger. Y'all should not be, and those people in those red shirts, our organizations, wore a red shirt with 0. He said, those people are spreading misinformation. Y'all are not to even consider them at all. DuPont is your friend. This is the guy that's, and I can't believe that that guy did this in front of God and everybody is recorded. He did it twice. But what hurts me is that the guy that we elected, this council, they did not stop. That was not on the agenda. I was not on the agenda. See, but even regardless of whether I was or not, the government didn't stand up for us in either case, from the state level to the people that we here in the parish elected. And that's why I'm saying I want the people to understand that just going to vote is not going to get it. You have to participate. This is a government of, by, and for. So it requires constant participation. We have to select our representatives. Don't let somebody else, your vote is worthless if somebody else selected your representative. So I'm hoping that we can get that sort of thing across, and that's one of the things that attracted these people here, because they know we're not organized, and that they're gonna just look at the tricks that they're using. That guy who was appointed by a governor to represent us, he looks just like us. The head of lobby, the head of the American Chemical Institute in Louisiana, they appoint guys who look just like me and you. See, and those guys come and do traditionally what has happened. They sell us out. And that's why we are after 6 years of trying to get a reduction of that horrible poison on the children at that school, it has increased 20%. And we got black legislators, we've got black representatives and senators. We've got the local government here who we elect. And still, black people get no redress. There's nothing for us. Our only hope is that we realize that we do have to participate and use the great geographic advantages and economic advantages here to our benefit. Blacks are the poorest people in this parish. We are at the bottom of everything here, and we are the majority. And therein lies the whole story of how these people are attracted to these areas. A good case in point, and I'll quit, was St. James Parish with the new attempt at Formosa. It took this judge up there to really take a look at that when she realized when they came here, these foreigners, and looked at the areas, there were 6 available areas. 5 of them was white and 1 was black. Do I have to tell you which one they chose?
I just want to briefly add why St. John Parish experienced so much pollution. One, piggybacking off what you said, Robert, Bobby, is every year, have y'all heard of DC Mardi Gras? It's an event, as you know, it's been 40 plus years that this event has been going on. During that time, I mean, you're celebrating Mardi Gras in Washington, D.C., which right there should tell you something's wrong with that, right? But all of our politicians and a lot of our tourism agencies go to D.C. for this big Mardi Gras ball. When they are there, it is all of the these big heavy industry base is backing this event. So they go there and openly party with these agencies that are trying to get into Louisiana. So while they are fiddling, Cajun fiddling, Rome is burning, Louisiana's burning, because that's what they want. That's the big party. So I think that when you connect the two and you see just how much they are doing, heavy industry, petrochemical is doing to be here in St. John the Baptist Parish, it's right there in the open. I've gone at least 3 times and I've seen it happening right in front of my eyes. Another reason is tax incentives. You incentivize these heavy industry to come here. I mean, as we are seeing right now with Greenfield and the tax incentives they're getting with the Port of South Louisiana, we're losing money, but that's okay, because as long as St. John Parish will lose over $200 million. $200 million. Who would sacrifice that amount of money to have any organization come in? But yet we do it here. And then we wonder why we have the highest, one of the highest risks for cancer in the country. It's right there in the books. It happens time and time again. And until we change that, we're going to always be in this position in Cancer Alley.
You know, there's we're talking about like the legacies of slavery here, and some of the things that you all just said are these very present things that are happening are so clearly tied to our past. And you were mentioning that the plant opens in 1963. Well, that's before 1964 and 65 with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And it's really important that a lot of that petrochemical development comes here to these majority black places in Louisiana before we have those acts pushed through Congress. And also, this issue about taxes is really, really critical here in Louisiana. This is a huge problem. You know, before the national income tax was passed in Louisiana, nationally. Before that, Louisiana went ahead and snuck in a constitutional amendment to prevent new industries from paying taxes. I'm talking about over 100 years ago, we did this right away. As soon as there's a threat of taxing these new industries, Louisiana says, nope, we're not going to do that. But there's a precedent for that. I mean, this is really critical because these sugar plantations were subsidized by the government too. The reason why these sugar plantations were so wealthy, now of course they're using slave labor, that's really important too. There's enslaved people not getting paid, but that's not why they're making money. They're making money because there were protective tariffs on sugar. So the federal government was taxing sugar that came from Cuba or that came from Jamaica, and there was not that same tax on Louisiana sugar, so it creates an artificial domestic market for these goods that are being produced by the labor of enslaved people. So when we think about where are these kind of Texans, where does this business mindset come from in Louisiana? I mean, you can look right here at the plantation and see we've been doing this since the 1700s, right? Now, right here in Wallace, we are fighting a new planned industrial development that would be kind of in between, truly on your fence line where y'all live, but it also would cut back diagonally across and come back beyond Whitney's fence line too. The Greenfield Grain Terminal is slated to be built at some point, but the land that they own, much of it historically was once Whitney Plantation. And now so the legacy of what happened here at Whitney Plantation when Formosa bought this land and intended to put a rayon manufacturing plant here, this kind of, you mentioned the illegal zoning that happened. This has really been a raw deal for people in Wallace, because what's happened is that you have heavy industry zoned just a few hundred feet from people's homes. And so now there's this fight ongoing, and you all are very instrumental in this, but there is a very familiar line being said about this development that I know that you all have encountered at different places, and I wonder if you can speak to. When we talk about these new industries coming into these rural places, we talk about job creation. And oftentimes these plants will come in and say, well, we're gonna bring this many jobs. Now, Greenfield's numbers are all over the place. And a lot of times you see temporary jobs, it's construction jobs. Now they're saying permanent, 100 jobs. Now, they can say they're gonna pay all of this money, but what I want you to speak to is how real is this? how real is this idea that these places are going to bring in jobs? Are the jobs that the petrochemical industry provides, are they good for St. John Parish citizens?
I would like to start off by saying that there is not one industry that owns jobs. So when we hear jobs, and it's like, you are not the only industry that has jobs. Why should we limit ourselves to someone else's limitations because they can't see beyond heavy industry? They can't see behind the marketing and the empty slogans. That's your problem. Why should it be ours? And we are claiming that we know there are different alternatives. We also are looking at the different numbers, and I'll let Joy explain that, being that, use her dust off our PhD in business. But yeah, it's just all these different facts and figures that we keep hearing over and over in a narrative, and it's just not true. Enough is enough. So yeah, it's just getting beyond the point that jobs are scarce and that the only way that we'll ever be employed is that we have to sacrifice ourselves for jobs. No, I mean, it's exactly what Joe was saying. We have to sacrifice ourselves, and then what Ashley was saying about the legacies of slavery. And this idea of economic development and jobs, what I have to consistently say, slavery was economic development, right? Black people had lots of jobs during slavery. How did that work out for us, right? We deserve better. We can do better. And like this, we have many options for different industries. But what was really problematic, we had an official that we were in conversation with, and we were asking that official why it's not people from our communities that are being employed at these jobs. So why are you giving away taxes for these industries to come here when it's not us at these jobs? And that person said to me, well, I tried to get people in this parish working, but I couldn't find anyone who could pass a drug test, or I couldn't find anyone who has the education. So automatically it's a weakness of us, right? It's a flaw for us. If it's about drugs, if you're saying that's the problem, then we don't need jobs, right? We need help treating the addiction problem, right? We need mental health resources. We need medical resources. Maybe we need to decriminalize some of the drugs that we're throwing people in jail for. Maybe that's the problem. But so yeah, I mean, it's already, like Mr. Bobby has said,
the relationship is already there. They start talking to these industries, start infiltrating public offices. They start going behind our back, not putting meetings on the record. Greenfield had secret meetings with our parish council members, with the Port of South Louisiana. You can find meetings where the Port of South Louisiana and Greenfield is talking about Whitney Plantation, and talking about me and Joe. A public entity, a powerful public entity paid with tax dollars that are talking about how they're going to target private citizens and how they're going to take care of a slavery museum. So these relationships, these deals are already done. And so by the time that it comes to the public knowledge, it's like scarcity, right? Which is another trick that's used against Black people and the legacy of slavery. Either you have this grain terminal or else. You're going to fall off the planet. You're going to, fly off into the orbit if you don't have this grain terminal to anchor y'all down, right? It's just the psychology is there. And again, it's one of those legacies of slavery that we have got to, as a community, like Mr. Bobby was saying, us coming together, we deserve better than this. We deserve better, and nobody is going to fight for us to get better, to have better than us. We are the strongest people in the fight, and we're the one, and we can do it. We're doing it now. We just have to not buy into the bull that people are telling us.
Yeah, and the facts are there. Let's just take, for instance, DuPont Danco. It's if this was only going to affect Reserve has a population of 10,000 people. They admit to us that they only employ 230 people, but they refuse to give us their personnel records. Now, we know that they affect really the entire parish, 46,000 people. So should we sacrifice the lives of 46,000 people? I wouldn't give up 10,000 people if it was just Reserve. If it was 230 people, if it was 230 of my relatives and friends, not only just Black. No, I could not accept the other 9,000 people to die and suffer so that I could have a job. But we know DuPont is not employing 5% of the local population. We know that. That's why they hired that personnel. We see that. Not only do we suffer from the effects of what the plant does, but we have to adjust our lives to the traffic of the shift changes at DuPont. We see all the traffic coming in from out of the parish and leaving at shift change. I mean, that is so crazy for them to say that they're doing, that we're benefiting from this by these job things. One of my friends who was trying to get a job at a plant, and he lived in the community, he was told by one of the people in personnel, if you really want a chance to get the job, give him an out-of-town address, in which the man did, and he got hired. Because they're going to hire people from outside of the community. We know that. It's blatant. Let them give up their personnel records. Let them. It's just, it's terrible. And we going to have to stand up to change it. Because obviously they own these politicians. Anytime a place like Marathon owes us $40 to $60 million, and one of our government officials refused to take the money, and the two other entities made some sort of typographical error or something in that thing that cost us $60 million? I mean, is this real? Am I making this up? Is this just one of the three agencies here that's supposed to benefit from that tax money? Not one of them got it. The school board, which benefits most, they made a mistake in one of their the council secretary, they say, posted it too late. They give us, what kind of foolishness is this? $40 to $60 million? And they raise our taxes. I got a friend right now crying because she failed to pay the property taxes, and the sheriff promptly confiscated her house and sold it at tax sale. But Marathon Oil giving back the $10 million that they owe the people. The people now have to stand up. This is beginning. I don't know how much farther this can go with the people we got supposedly representing us. How could this big plant here, and we have not talked about the environmental impact of that place, second largest one in the country, right? How could we let these people get away with this? How could these politicians walk among us? Is that not the prime example of what a Judas is, of what a traitor is? We are the poorest people in this community, and this place got $60 million. They owe us rightfully, legally, and we don't get it. Our schools are suffering. The police department say they're suffering. The council, all of the streets, and we give these guys $60 million. We shouldn't give them $1. They're making billions and trillions of dollars here off of us. Why? If we're going to have socialism, let's have it. Not for the big industry, though. Let's take care of the people.
All right, I'm going to wrap up with just one final question for all y'all. What does St. John Parish need from people who want to help, and how can people get involved?
What we need are, at least I think in our case, but I could assume for Bobby's case too, but we need more, we need voices, we need participation. We'll have different permit applications that are submitted, or different petitions that we have. Actually, we have a petition that's on our website about the grain elevator. We need voices because we need to speak out about this. Right now, Greenfields has headquarters in Denver, Colorado. They chose Denver over New Orleans and Houston. So that just shows you how important voices from all over matter. Because I would like the people of Denver to understand what's being backed. They're getting tax incentives, by the way, in Denver, Colorado. So that state is giving them tax money to do this to our community. But those voices are also voices that we need in this fight to offer that type of input as well. We can push these different businesses, these investors, into doing the right thing. Because it's not just these companies, it's everyone who plays a part in these organizations that's also doing this to us as well. And it's time we hold everyone accountable, and everyone's voice needs to be heard in that matter. Well, we have a website, the DescendantsProject.org. You can sign up for our newsletter where we'll give you updates. We're also on social media, on Facebook Live. A lot of you have seen us stirring up trouble there, but yeah, getting it out there. So just any input that you can give, and we so value your voice and your thoughts.
And specifically, we need support against this investor in the grain terminal. His name is Christopher James. He is perpetuating himself as a green investor. He has the New York financial community. He's trying to fool people there in Washington, D.C., and Colorado, and he's based in San Francisco. He has a beautiful organic vineyard in San Francisco while he's trying to destroy our community. So yeah, any action, when I say action, I mean just any voice, like signing a petition, any support in that end to let the world know who this man is, we would really appreciate it.
What I think we need most is each other. I think if we, the people here, that 92% of victims, if we come together in what is natural to us, love. See, one of the things we are known for our community is our openness and love and the natural way that we are attracted to each other. We have to, as a people, need to come back to that, and as a community. The only obstacle I see for us right now is disunity. The only reason they're winning, that's the only reason they are winning, is because we have not embraced each other completely as a people. as a community and stand up for our, right now we got to stand up for our lives. They are going to wipe us out. We are a sacrificed people. It's blatant now, it's in our face. So let's do what is really natural to us. Let's love one another and let's come together as a people. And I heard someone say that we are a sleeping giant. And the day we wake up, we'll change in a twinkling of an eye. And we can do it, people. We are a great people.
All right, everyone, for our final speaker today, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Craig Colten. Craig Colten is Professor Emeritus at Louisiana State University, and before retirement, he held the position of Carl O. Sauer Professor of Geography. He has studied and written about Louisiana's struggles with hazards and the social and environmental justice implications of their impacts for over 20 years. He is the author of An Unnatural Metropolis, Wresting New Orleans from Nature, Southern Waters, The Limits of Abundance, and State of Disaster, A Historical Geography of Louisiana's Land Loss Crisis. And I do believe we have those books for sale here today, so if you've seen those on the back table, and if you want to buy one of those books, just take it over to the Visitor Center and they'll ring you up. I've read Dr. Colten's work a lot in my own work as a dissertation writer, as a PhD student, so I'm so thrilled he's here. Please welcome Dr. Craig Colten.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've been down here several times, and this building is just, it's a moving experience for me to be in here. And I still wait for these children to start behaving like a lot of children. They get loud and rowdy and cutting up. But these are some of the most well-behaved children I've ever been around. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Although I have a big job ahead of me, following that last panel is going to be no small feat. That was really a splendid gathering and an expression of ideas. So I think we're going to have some help with the slides. Okay. When I do this or this, you can advance. I like to do the tug the mustache as the cue, but I'll probably do this. Just outside the bounds of this historic site is the Mississippi River. It created a vast muddy floodplain and a delta that became the home for prehistoric peoples, territory contested by colonial settlers, and then over time, a setting for agriculture, and more recently, a mixture of agriculture and large-scale industry. And what I want to do today is trace the transformation of the floodplain by human endeavors, and to consider how both physical and human sacrifices, we talked about sacrifice before, that have been made since human initiated their reconfiguration of this territory have played out over the last several thousand years. We'll really focus on the last century, but we'll touch a little bit on a much deeper past. Next one. This is an incredibly dynamic setting, and this is what we don't see as we drive around the river parishes. But during the period of the end of the last glacial age, about 15,000 years ago, there were glaciers over Canada and down into the American Midwest that were 5,000 feet thick. They were a mile thick. Those glaciers, during a phase, a climate of global warming, melted, and huge volumes of water came pouring down the Mississippi River Channel, and it carved this gigantic entrenchment that you see on the left there. That water also filled the Gulf in, which at the end of the Ice Age was several hundred feet lower than it is now. As that water filled up the Gulf, the river began to change the shape of this entrenchment. It began filling in the entrenchment with sediment. Each year, each spring, more water would come down, it would flood, and the flood water would spill over and drop sediment out and build land. right adjacent to the river, there was always a slightly higher shoulder of ground we call the natural levee. And this plantation, this site is on a natural levee. And the plantations wouldn't have been here had there not been natural levees. So about 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, that river began filling in this channel. Next one. And what you end up with is this. This is a cross section at Baton Rouge, which shows. 1 second, I'm going to get my little pointer. There's nothing more frustrating than a speaker waving his hand, expecting you to know where he's pointing. So, I did come semi-prepared. So what you have here is in this swath of land between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, well, here we go. Between Baton Rouge and Lafayette, there's this wide floodplain. Multiple rivers have flown across it, the Mississippi, the Atchafalaya, and Bayou Teche. Each of those has settlement along its banks in places that were on land made by the river. Next one. Since the arrival, before even the arrival of Europeans, Native Americans used this river. It was an important corridor of exchange. Trade goods went from the coast of Louisiana up to Minnesota and Wisconsin, and trade goods from those areas came down. This was an important corridor of transportation even in prehistoric times. Next one. When the French arrived, they decided they'd make their territorial claims based on the river. They claimed the whole Mississippi River basin. So they used the river as the basis for territorial control and dominion. And they assumed, as they arrived here, that they'd have more or less a steady climate. That climate was not changing. And they began to build a society based on that current climate. As the country became more populated, you have development further up in the basin. We begin to see the Mississippi River continue to play that role of a trade corridor. The riverboatmen floated goods down from the Ohio River Valley and the Tennessee River Valley, flowing by here down to New Orleans. And then later, steamboats expanded the volume of trade on the river. And all that trade was in part influenced by the seasonality of the climate. Spring floods, dry season. It was easier to take a steamboat back upriver during the dry season, much easier during the high river to float downstream. Next one. Of course, high river was a chronic problem at New Orleans. Regular flooding was ever-present threat during the spring. The same processes that built this floodplain were trying to build more land in New Orleans. Next one. And of course, on that floodplain, if you wanted a little closer look, you can look at my tie here. It's the same map. Agriculture found a place here. The French experimented with different crops, but eventually, after rice, sugarcane took hold, and this became a sugarcane country. Next one, please. Eventually, industry came here. So we've seen this massive sequence, this remarkable sequence of events in the last 300 years or plus along the river. So, next one, please. This is a story, though, of transformation of the river valley in two basic parts. One, adapting agriculture to this place, to a subtropical environment which was very foreign to the French. They didn't go through climate change, they went to a different climate, okay? And they had to adapt. This was very different for them. Then what we see here in more recent years, in the 20th century, we see another adaptation in a different climate. We're talking about political climate. What is the climate that allowed this transformation, encouraged the kind of development we've seen over the last century plus? Okay, next one. Now, as the river was building land, Native Americans, some of the earliest people living in South Louisiana, were a group called the Tchefuncte, Native Americans. They actually built land in the marshes They followed the land as it was being built and extended out into the Gulf of Mexico in order to sustain their diets, which relied on creatures, some marine, some more brackish marsh creatures, but they actually built mounds. And you can see, particularly this one on the right here, Big Oak Islands and Pine Island, which are in New Orleans. Those were vast areas built on waste shells. They lived on top of a mound that was elevated like a small island in the marsh. So this was the first transformation. Next one. More recent transformation, now we're hearing news that these Indian mounds on the LSU campus are the oldest human-built structures in North America, dating possibly back 10,000 years or so. And that green dot is more or less where that is. But most of the subsequent development to the Chifunctas, Native Americans built on areas that were elevated and not subject to flooding. Those Indian mounds, if you go to LSU, are on slightly higher ground. They're up on what we call the terrace. Next one. If you go up further upstream, these are the mounds at Poverty Point, about 3,000 years old, 3,500 years old. Another similar location, not on the Mississippi, but on Bayou Mason, and they also share this position near the river, but on higher ground. And next one. And then Cahokia, which is up the red dot up near across the river from St. Louis, was perhaps the biggest concentration of people in North America at about 1,500 years ago. They were largely displaced by climate change. They didn't disappear entirely, they didn't abandon the city entirely, but a large number of them migrated on. Drought and periodic flooding on a floodplain site caused this civilization to disperse. Next one. Then the French arrive, okay? In 1719, they began building the city of New Orleans. They carved it out of a forest on the banks of the Mississippi, on the floodplain. They knew this was a floodplain. The various early accounts of French traveling up the Mississippi River talk about the flooding, how the water was running through the trees and the cane. This was a place they knew to be flood prone. But there were reasons they built the city there. Next one. This was a site that was on the outer bank of the river. And it was also at a site where there was an easy portage between what became New Orleans and Lake Pontchartrain. They could sail ocean-going ships up into Lake Pontchartrain and then transfer the goods into the city and not have to sail 100 miles upriver, up current. So there was certain logic here. And on the outer bank, the river tends to be a little bit higher, and you also have, as mentioned earlier, a deeper channel for the boats. It's just an easier place to load and unload ships. So there was a geographic logic to building the city there. Next one. As time passed and more settlers arrived in New Orleans, we see a continuation of the tendency, the absolute obsession with building on the natural levee, the slightly higher ground. This is a map from the Historic New Orleans collection. You can see all the squares, the rectangles. These are houses, basically plantation homes built close to the river on the highest ground. The ground from the river towards the back swamp slopes downward very, very gently. If you're riding a bicycle, you wouldn't even hardly notice the tilt unless you're old like me and you're riding uphill. Then you even notice that half an inch per mile. The settlement tended to be concentrated on the natural levee. Next one. All around the cities were cypress. And despite failed efforts to grow things like indigo and wheat in New Orleans, wheat certainly didn't work. The first commercial commodity to come out of colonial Louisiana was cypress. This durable wood, light wood, easy to work, was cut from the swamps around New Orleans, cut into boards, and shipped to the Caribbean to French and also Spanish consumers, even though the French weren't supposed to be trading with the Spanish. But this cypress in the back swamps, those areas off the natural levee, down where it was a little bit lower and muddier and swampier, this was the first important commercial commodity. As I mentioned before, there was a constant threat of flooding. And we see here, this is a picture that shows the levee at New Orleans. This is the French Quarter, or the Jackson Square, but this shows the bank to preserve the town from inundation. That's what that label says. So the founders of the colony of New Orleans, or the colony of Louisiana, began building levees. And in 1723, they actually passed a law saying landowners up and downstream had to continue to build levees further up and downstream so that you wouldn't have what we call backdoor flooding into New Orleans. Okay, next one. By the end of the colonial era, by statehood, we see levees had extended all the way up to Baton Rouge on the east bank and even further upstream up to near New Roads on the west bank. This channeled the river, pitched it between the levees, and actually by the 1850s they were recognizing that that made flood stages higher. And time after time, when there was a new flood, they would realize they had to build slightly taller levees. So they were building themselves into a situation, a perpetual situation. They didn't realize at the time, but when you confine a river between levees, the bottom bed tends to rise. And they didn't realize that in the 1720s or 30s or even in 1812, although it was being recognized by 1850s. But this meant they were in a perpetual process to invest more money to build bigger levees, wider levees, and they were committed, what we call path dependence. This became the only real solution to flooding. Next one, please. Now, these early levees, built by individual, paid for by individual plantation owners, built with enslaved labor, they were not necessarily perfect structures. They were inconsistent in design. They weren't always maintained as they should have been. These landowners didn't want to divert labor from cultivation to protecting their neighbors, okay? So we see this frequent process of flooding. Next one. And in part, one of the first real important adaptations was shifting from indigo to rice. Rice was grown widely up and down this part of the river in the mid-18th century. Rice was able to accommodate these spring floods. They actually talked about it as providential rice. If you had a big flood, it was good for the crop, okay? If you had the flood, it was considered good. So this was a water-dependent crop, and this was one adaptation people made to this strange environment, and that related to the process of acquiring labor from Africa. They actually, planters in Louisiana and elsewhere, in South Carolina in particular, sought slaves from particular parts of Africa that had knowledge of building sluices and structures that facilitated and enabled rice cultivation. They brought in the experts. They didn't call them the experts, but they brought in experts. They explicitly sought them. So this wasn't just, the slaves were not just providing labor, they were providing intellectual contributions to the creation of this plantation wealth. Next one, please. However, after the end of the Civil War, the levees were in bad condition, and we see we also have seen for more than half a century an expanding practice of sugarcane cultivation. Cane was really pushing the upper limits of the climate for growing cane. It wasn't the best suited crop. It requires dry footing, so it required good, dependable, secure levees, which weren't really available. But after the Civil War, the planters and politicians from Louisiana and Mississippi convinced Congress to spend money on building a more consistent and stronger levee system. Incidentally, they did this not for flood protection. They couldn't, the Congress couldn't, the congressional delegations from Louisiana and Mississippi couldn't convince Congress to pass it for flood protection for people who had recently rebelled, right? They couldn't get the government to spend money on levees to protect these planters. So they brought in a hydrologist who said, well, actually, a river confined between two levees will actually dig a deeper channel. It's good for commerce. It's good for interstate commerce. So the first levees were built for navigational purposes, not flood protection. That lasted for about half a century. But after the Civil War, we see this real push to build bigger and better levees. Next one. So those levees grew in size, and Congress created the Mississippi River Commission in 1879. Next one. and they built bigger levees. But it wasn't until 1882, when there was a massive flood, that Congress actually appropriated money towards this effort. And what we see here is a change in philosophy in how to build levees. Rather than have what they called, rather than allowing natural outlets, bayous, serve as escape hatches, safety valves, they closed off all the old bayous, Bayou Lafourche, Bayou Plaquemine, Bayou Manchac. They built levees over the mouths or the upper end of those bayous, kept everything in the main channel. This was a levees-only approach. It was going to be cheaper than building levees along all the outlets and the river, okay? And it was something really favored by the people in New Orleans. But this closed the distributaries. Next one, please. As that was going on in this post-war period, we also see a process where investors from the Midwest and these big timber companies began investing in cypress lands and cypress mills in the Atchafalaya. So we begin to see the transformation of the Mississippi River Basin, moving away from just the river, the main river, but into the Atchafalaya, which is functionally part of the Mississippi River system. So they went into the Atchafalaya Basin to harvest these trees. Next one. They brought in crews, they brought in technology, and they began denuding the Atchafalaya Basin of cypress trees. Next one, please. In 1880, Louisiana had about 1.6 million acres of cypress forest. By 1934, there were only 22,000 acres left. 1.6 million to 22,000. This was one of the sacrifices made. The cypress forest, which doesn't grow back rapidly, was basically sacrificed for investors, mainly from the Middle West. Next one. Oh, and by the way, in 1915, there were 150 cypress mills to indicate how fast this collapsed. By 1940, there were only 4 left, and the last one closed in 1956. And there's no cypress mills now. There's a few people that do sort of, they have portable cypress mills. They go around and cut what they call sinker cypress that they drag up from the bottom of the rivers and bays and stuff. But in the meantime, the Corps had made considerable progress on securing the levee system. And by 1926, the Mississippi River Commission announced that the levee system is now in condition to prevent the disastrous effects of flood. 1926. You know what happened the next year, don't you? This was the big flood, right? So we have this massive flood. Levees start breaking upstream in Arkansas and Mississippi, destroying hundreds of thousands of acres. There were 13 million acres were flooded. Some 246, which is probably a severe undercount, were killed. 137,000 buildings destroyed, and nearly 750,000 people driven from their homes. And we didn't have the kind of population density that we did during Katrina. And only about 800,000 people evacuated from New Orleans from Katrina. So these were huge and devastating numbers. And this event, the failure of the levee system, was a huge humiliation for the Corps, particularly with their audacity and their hubris that the point they made the year before. So, next one, please. So that year, the Corps of Engineers said, we're going to scrap this levees only and go to a policy they call levees and outlets. They're going to reintroduce safety valves. They're going to create artificial outlets. One, they're going to use the Atchafalaya Basin, which was still sort of functioning as a safety valve, but they also talked about building one, which is now the Bonnie Carey Spillway, and then they talked about building another one down south of New Orleans, downstream from New Orleans at Carnarvon. The first two were built, the Atchafalaya and the Bonnie Carey. The Carnarvon was never constructed. But that was to, in part, provide protection. But they also invested in building bigger and taller levees. And so we see what happens when you build levees 2 or 3 feet higher. You have to have a lot more width. It takes 5 to 6 feet of width to support at least a foot of elevation and height. So you already had people in towns up and down the river living close to the levee in these little towns. That meant whole neighborhoods were knocked out. This is a picture of Plaquemine, which you can't see very well, but go to the next one. The three circles, and the one on the left is 1925, before the levees were enlarged. The other one's 1930, after the levees were enlarged. And you can see these whole neighborhoods were erased. Who lived near the levees? Like in most cases, low-income minority population. People who lived near the river worked oftentimes as stevedores and people who loaded the boats and cut wood and supplied the boats with fuel. Next one, please. Bayou Gula, downstream from Plaquemine, not too far, was another place where there was dislocation. Bayou Gula, there were 16 stores and 92 dwellings that had to be relocated. Really disruptive to community. This was largely an African-American community. Next one. If we also look at the broader plan here, this is a plan for the Bonnie Carey spillway. And I have encircled these little towns. The Corps of Engineers were really masters of cartography for development, okay? They didn't show where people lived. They had these little tiny dots that look like towns are inconsequential, that nobody's going to be disturbed, and they don't show the cemeteries, they don't show the communities, the houses that were actually removed, okay? Next one. Likewise, in the Atchafalaya Basin, they show a few little towns on the outskirts, but nothing that was going to happen inside the Atchafalaya. So these were the plans, basically cartographically removing the population who'd be impacted the most. Next one. I've read the accounts of the various people who had their properties bought, and there was real opposition. There were people in the Atchafalaya Basin who fought back against this, but New Orleans wanted the Atchafalaya used as a spillway, as an outlet, a flood safety valve. They wanted it because it would take pressure off the levees at New Orleans, and they wouldn't have to build taller levees and displace urban populations, which would be a lot more expensive. They wouldn't have to build higher docks to accommodate floodwaters. So they were really all in favor. The people in New Orleans were all in favor of diverting the risk down the Atchafalaya. The people who lived in the Atchafalaya, however, they protested, but they were fewer in number, had less political clout, and their concerns were overridden. And we see community after community disrupted. Next one, please. Some of the effects weren't immediate. This is a map that shows each of these little blue stars is a small fishing community, mostly people who lived in fishing boats, okay? This was taken, this is a map from 1920 that was done by Jim Delahousie. And notice Grand Lake. Grand Lake is kind of a place where the Atchafalaya River kind of expands and becomes this really slow-moving, almost imperceptibly moving body of water. Next one. And the people who lived in those towns were fishermen. They went out and caught fish, and live boats would come up from Morgan City and haul the boats to Morgan City, and they'd be sold in the markets in New Orleans. And by 1958, we begin to see the impacts of this transformation. More water, more sediment flowing into the Atchafalaya Basin. And when the river entered this lake, where there wasn't enough current to keep the sediment afloat, it settled out and built a big delta. So if you look just to the right of where it says Byans Canal, that's the delta that filled in 3/4 at least of Grand Lake. It made it impossible to make a living fishing, and most of those people who lived in those fishing communities dragged their boats out of the basin, outside the levees, and lived in houseboats on dry land. So this is another impact on society, a dislocation of these fishing communities and fishing families. Next one, please. Now, all while that was going on, I want to jump back in time just a little bit back to this part of the world. These are illustrations from my colleague Jay Edwards' book, Plantations by the River. And these are great illustrations, paintings that were done in the 19th century. And the circled areas show the mill. The mill was the industrial operation of every sugar plantation. In the early 19th century, almost every sugar plantation had a mill. And this is the grinding mill where they take the cane and run it between rollers to squeeze the juice out that's then made into raw brown sugar. Okay, and then it's sent off somewhere else to be granulized and made into white sugar. But this was an important part of every plantation. Next one, please. But with the advent of the 20th century, we begin to see a gradual progression of more and more mechanization. Less labor is needed. And one of the first things to begin to disappear from the sugarcane landscape were the sugarcane mills. These white dots, the hollow dots, show sugarcane mills that had closed closed since 1969, between 69 and 90. There were 300 mills operating in 1870. That was down to 275 by 1900. By 1930, there were 70 and only 20 in 1996, and that's probably been cut about in half since then. This was a matter of economics of scale. With machinery, people could harvest more cane, but they could also haul their cane longer distances with tractors or trucks to a grinding mill. So there wasn't a need for every plantation to maintain a mill, which are expensive and require labor, okay? And it's land that you might be able to sell to this emerging petrochemical industry, right? Oftentimes these petrochemical plants bought the old industrial part of the plantation when it was no longer needed on the mill. So the decline of the mills was an opening in some ways for transfer of land to new economic activity. Next one, please. So we begin to see in the 20th century in particular this conversion, this secondary transition from agricultural dependence to a merging of agriculture and industry. And this picture on the right shows sugarcane key fields in the early part of the season with a petrochemical plant across from Baton Rouge a few years ago. Next one, please. And that transition, we see a reduction in acreage in sugarcane. Plants, of course, can absorb carbon. The plants that replaced them were not organic plants, but they were industrial plants, and they emit carbon gases. And the first of the real big plants to arrive in Louisiana was Standard Oil, which is now ExxonMobil. It started operation in Baton Rouge in 1909. It's not on the floodplain. It's up on the terrace north of Baton Rouge. Next one. But by 1930, we have two other new plants. What's used to be Shell, Norco, and then there was another refinery that went in, Pelican Refinery down at Chalmette. That's now another company. But we see the first of the plants all attached to places near the city where there was labor, okay? Despite the fact that all the trade literature, all the guidance for people investing in and building chemical plants was to stay away from people because because of explosions and noxious emissions, all these kind of things we're worried about today. They were advised not to locate near people because of these very same things that continue to be a problem today, okay? They also located near the river. We've heard people talk about that already. The river was really important for transportation. Sometimes raw materials came in, and in many cases, finished product went out. And the other thing the river did is it served as a transport for effluent, liquid waste. The Mississippi was seen as this ultimate, unquenchable diluting machine, that it could handle as much discharge as could be thrown at it. Next one, please. So after World War II, we see a secondary phase of industrial plant expansion. Begun during World War II, there was a lot of federal dollars invested in expanding and enlarging plants, particularly Baton Rouge and other plants. But we see a shift from strictly in the urban areas near New Orleans, Norco, New Orleans, and Baton Rouge, and we see more and more plants going into rural areas. And despite the guidance to stay away from people, these plants began building in rural areas because they didn't see the people who were there. Just like the Corps didn't include the people on their maps, the site selection groups from these companies didn't see, in many cases, these small African-American communities that have become, in some cases, fence row communities. Next one. So we see this real expansion. into the rural areas. We also see an expansion of water pollution that was occurring. The state actually had a water pollution control commission that it started in 1940. And what's really interesting about that is the companies who were being regulated actually paid the salary of the people who wrote what the standards were, how much of a concentration of chemicals could be put into the rivers. This is documented in state records. The state really created this favorable climate, this favorable political climate for industry. We heard about the tax breaks and all those kind of things, which I'm not going to get into because that was covered earlier. But we see pollution getting worse and worse. And by the 1950s, both the U.S. Public Health Service and the U.S. Geological Survey were talking about the concerns with water pollution. There had been a few steps taken to try to minimize discharges. You know, people were encouraged to discharge during high river stage, but that's only a few months of the year, and they didn't want to hold it back the rest of the year. But we see pollution rising in concern. Next one, please. And the real turning point with pollution occurred in 1963 when there was a massive release of Adjourn. Adjourn is a chemical used to kill a pest that gets into sugarcane. And everybody assumed it was stuff that was running off the sugarcane fields down here. Killed some 5 million fish in the river and out into the Gulf of Mexico. Nobody knows the exact total, of course, but that's an estimate. But this was just after Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, that talked about the risk of chemicals in the environment. And the chemical industry really fought back vigorously against this. And basically they said, okay, the industry and federal agencies realized it was not from agriculture, but from an Adjourn manufacturer up in Memphis that had released the chemical into the river. So the chemical industry side relief, because it's one company, it's not all of us, right? It's not the companies down here, they were let off the hook. But this still sparked additional concern and additional awareness, and was one of the things that led to the first real effective federal laws, the Clean Water Act in 1972. It contributed to that. And ultimately, with the passage of laws in the 1970s and 1980s, environmental laws, we begin to see less pollution going into the river. That's a good thing, yes, but there was still waste. And we begin to see more and more waste going from the water into the atmosphere. Next one, I'm sorry, I didn't give you the cue. You'll see more stuff going into the atmosphere and onto land. This picture on the left is Willie Fontenot's picture of the ExxonMobil explosion in 1989. I'm sorry, it's a little dark. But that's atmospheric emissions, and we still have considerable atmospheric emissions. The other picture on the right is a Superfund site, which was a dump operated by a commercial operator who would take waste from the companies and put them in a big excavation just outside Baton Rouge. And so we see a shift from the water sink to the atmospheric sink and a land sink. Next one, please. And there were a lot of people contributing to this. This is a map from a textbook that I co-authored. It shows there's some 109 industries, and that's not all of them, between basically just from St. Francisville to downstream from New Orleans. This is a huge number. And, you know, most people would look at that and say, oh, that's a map of economic success. Big industry, right? Next one. But when you take the names of these familiar companies off and put the chemicals they're producing on, you get a whole different thing. These are these 5, 6 syllable words of all the chemicals produced, and it doesn't even indicate the waste products. But this is what I think people have become aware of in recent decades, and not just in recent years, but really since the 1980s. Next one, please. This shows the little purple triangles are toxic release sites where toxic emissions are released, and Louisiana typically ranks in the top 5 nationally in toxic releases. These are legally permitted releases reported by industry. And then the green dots are the Superfund sites, the places where wastes were dumped over time and pose a particular threat. Now, this is the basic distribution. But what does that mean in terms of environmental justice concerns and its relationship to people? Next one, please. In the 1980s, we begin to see, this was the year the Superfund Act was passed, which began to regulate these old, forgotten dumps. And it was also a year when there was a big chemical disaster in Bhopal, India, okay? That heightened concern here, mainly because it was that same time BASF, who's mentioned in this sign, the first sign declaring Cancer Alley, BASF was having labor problems, and they locked out their workers at their Geismar plant that made the same chemical that was accidentally released in Bhopal, okay? That's when local people began to get seriously concerned about toxic emissions. There had been a long-standing opinion in many places around the country and in this part of the world as well, is that, well, good jobs offset the risk. But in this instance, when they had temporary, unskilled, untrained workers operating the plant, there began to be a real concern among the local population. There was a really strong pushback against this notion of good jobs offset the risk. So this combination of factors of recent events and this labor struggle galvanized population, and we begin to see a real hardy environmental justice movement in Louisiana. It's really quite remarkable given the public support, at least political support, for big industry. Louisiana really had a pretty dramatic rise in environmental justice activity. And there's room for more growth, as we've heard today. How do we get people next to these plants? How has that happened? How has that happened geographically over time? Next one, please. This shows a little town of Reveille in the circle there, which is just downstream from Plaquemine. It's one of these many little linear communities that were oftentimes developed after the Civil War. Emancipated enslaved laborers were given a strip of land, a little tiny strip of land, one little street wide enough for a row of houses on either side of the street. Plantation owners wanted to keep the labor close at hand, so they gave them this property. They had to pay rent, of course, or buy the property, but they made this sort of housing accommodation because they needed these people who were skilled at maintaining the mills, okay? So you have a lot of these little narrow linear communities. Next one. And what we see here from that map from 1950 and 1998, notice Reveille, that town is gone. The property was bought out by, this is a Georgia Pacific plant, and the community was completely dispersed, disintegrated, scattered. You lose community. And some of the people earlier today were talking about one of the things that makes this place so important to them is the sense of community. Well, that was being demolished. Next one, please. We see the same sort of thing in Baton Rouge. Across from the, adjacent to the ExxonMobil, there used to be kind of an L-shaped workers community that was actually initially built by a subsidiary of ExxonMobil. And it initially, through the 1920s, housed largely white workers who worked within walking distance of the mill of ExxonMobil. By the 60s and 70s, that neighborhood was undergoing some racial turnover. It was the white workers were moving to the white suburbs, white flight was in action, and we begin to see this neighborhood change its color, basically. And after that big explosion in 1989, ExxonMobil bought as many of those houses as they possibly could, not because they were following the guidance to make sure people weren't near the plant for health reasons, but because they didn't want to get a lawsuit if the explosion went off and the house was shattered or people were suffered an injury. So they were buying themselves what we call a green buffer zone, okay? And so we see, it's hard to see here, but this area just south and just to the east is this giant swath of green space that ExxonMobil maintains today. It looks like a park, but there's a few scattered houses still in that area. But it was buying themselves a degree of legal, a buffer against legal liability. Next one, please. Similarly, at Plaquemine, the Dow plant in Plaquemine, there's a historic plaque now showing where Morrisonville was, which was a little African-American community adjacent to the Dow plant. Dow bought it, dispersed them, and the residents can go one day out of the year to visit the graves of their family members that are still within the Dow property. Okay, so this was dismantling community. And I'm sure the companies would say, well, we're also saving them from exposure. And yes, to a degree they are, but there are plenty of examples where they haven't. The people down at Norco, the little community of Diamond, fought for years to get a buyout. They finally did achieve that. But it was done not so much for altruistic reasons as a way, rather as a means to avoid liability risk. Next one. That's it? Next one, please. There should be a couple more. Yeah, here we go. Now, I'm almost done here. When the companies come into Louisiana, they have to file for a permit to build. And this is a map from one of the Shintech applications. And you'll notice maybe a familiar cartographic technique. Where are the people here? Okay. One of our graduate students did this work, and I'm just cribbing his maps here. But they had to show a 1 mile buffer, and there's no people shown. What our student did is he reemphasized where the people live. Next one, please. And you see not just, next one. You see not just, and here the reddish areas, the dark areas are where people live. And you see not just one plant, like it's there all by itself, but you see many plants with overlapping buffer zones, in many cases overlapping these neighborhoods. And this doesn't even show you where schools are, which sometimes fall within those buffers, where kids spend a good chunk of the day. So we've seen this cartographic erasure of people as a fairly standard technique. Next one, please. One of the hardest things to do is to demonstrate convincingly that emissions cause a particular illness. We have the cancer registry here in Louisiana, which consistently finds that there is no relationship. Other scholars, toxicologists, and others find otherwise. And this is a report that just came out in 2020 that did find that people who live in fence row communities for an extended period of time have a 30% higher risk of getting leukemia. Okay, this is, and they look not just at Louisiana but other places as well. So this is a sound bit of research, better than some that I've seen. We had a student at LSU who did some work that said it wasn't just exposure, but one of the other problems here in Louisiana is access to medical care. This student in the early 2000s found that Louisiana didn't necessarily have the highest rate of cancer mortality. Or excuse me, didn't have the highest rate of cancer, but we had a higher rate than most other places of cancer fatalities. And that was mainly due because people couldn't afford reasonable, decent medical care. So, next one, please. So what we've seen here is a valley fully transformed over the years. And when we tell the story, when other people tell the story of Louisiana, with the view of plantation owners, or from the view of the petrochemical industry, you can talk about a transformation of the Lower River as a tale of grand accomplishment, right? Adaptation to a new and unfamiliar climate. This ingenuity and adaptation. And ultimately, that brings economic prosperity. If you listen to the Corps of Engineers tell it, this is a tale of amazing engineering feats and the prevention of millions of dollars worth of flood damage with this levee system, which, by the way, is an additional subsidy for the planters and the chemical industries that no one ever factors in. But when we have a more complete accounting, not just of the obvious benefits to a few, we can see that this is a tale that has many facets of environmental damage, both in the Atchafalaya Basin and to the lands and waters of the river, to the atmosphere the residents breathe, and is a tale of displacement of poor and marginalized people to enable others to accumulate wealth. As part of a wider story, this transformation has contributed to global warming. A climate of political permissiveness has allowed mineral extraction from beneath Louisiana and its processing along the lower Mississippi River. So even if we can clean up toxic pollution now, greenhouse gases will continue to spew into the atmosphere, and the process of global warming continues. And with global warming, we're already seeing increased flood risk in the Mississippi River Basin. The levees that stand out here were built to prevent a flood like 1927, not a flood that may come in 2027. And we've had more openings of the Bonnie Carey this century than we did in 70 years in the last century. So we're seeing bigger volumes of water, more extended periods of high water. We can expect more of that to continue, I think. So it's really a complex history, with cause perhaps for some celebration and likewise some commiseration. There have been many sacrifices made to transform the lower river. And places like the Whitney Plantation are helping us gain a fuller appreciation for this longer neglected side of the story. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take some questions if there's time.
Let's see, we have, I neglected to do a Q&A before lunch, but we do have about just a couple minutes if there's any questions.
When the residents were renters, so they would go to the landowners who were they offered a reasonable price. In some of these other places, they would simply go in and offer them a deal that they considered too good to refuse. It was not necessarily much, but it was more than they might expect. And they were oftentimes told of the risks of living there, which they hadn't been told of previously.
Can I answer that question? In our situation, for most of it, the same thing, this was in the 1990s. They sent agents out into our communities, actually, to, I'll say, seduce the people of the community. And one of the strategies they used was, if you're friends with us, if you stay close to us, we'll protect you, and we'll give you money for your home, and as long as we stay in a good relationship. Otherwise, we're just going to take you home. So we were told we were going to be forced to move, and if we cooperated with them, at least gave us a good deal for our communities. And they're very nefarious to that. I mean, they really just came in and pretended like they were our friends. And we thought we had no fight against them. So it's just, they come in out there, so many different treacherous methods, and techniques that they use in order to get communities on their side.
Also note that some of those communities were actually still active plantations. So if a plantation early on, if they're selling a whole plantation, those people who are living there, they don't own that land. You know, they're still living in the quarters. People were living in the quarters here on Whitney Plantation until 1975. So if this had sold, you know, there would have been, they displaced the people here for the purposes of selling it for industry. Any other questions that we have from the audience?
What would you envision a more equitable levy system to look like? Like if they were to put you on a panel and ask you that, what would either pass things that they shouldn't have done or looking forward what they need to do to make it better for this community?
That's a tall order, and I think I would run away from an invitation to serve on such a body. Yeah. But I think in the long run, we need to stop thinking about how to raise the levees, which is the fundamental strategy, and building reservoirs to capture the river water upstream, and begin to think about how we reconfigure and make it safe to live here without the levees. And that's gets into some of the thinking that coming out of Europe on Make Room for the River, where you begin to open up. You don't necessarily have to eliminate all levees, but you make a wider corridor for the river so it's not so that flood stages aren't getting higher every year, that there's room for the river to meander a bit more. And I think that can be done relatively easily, and it wouldn't require this massive ongoing reinvestment in raising the levees.
I just really appreciate you showing with the Corps of Engineers and the maps and the communities erased. Because me, Ashley, and Joe, I think were the only ones here that were part of the Section 106 process, which is the historic preservation side of it. Anytime there's a project that applies for federal permitting, then there's this process where you're protecting the historic, where there's a review of the historical resources that are involved. And we were consulting we were given consulting status, and so was Whitney. And some of the maps that were shown to us, the renderings of the grain terminal, was what was massive, but there was nothing around it. And so we were all sitting in the meeting, with the Corps of Engineers, and we gasped like, oh my God, where is the houses? And immediately someone from the Corps of Engineers side said, no, this is just the standard. It's not them, it's just that's the industry standard, it's just the facility. So I think it's really, I just want to point out that is absolutely true, the way that this is being used as, this is standard operating procedure for you to be erased, right? And the idea of maybe the procedure needs to change was not the issue, it's just, y'all just need to calm down, folks. So I just really appreciate you bringing that out in your presentation today.
And thank you. And I will say that there might have been a little bit firmer rationale in the 1920s for having very simple maps. There's no reason today, with this satellite imagery, you can show the houses. There's really no reason today.
I really appreciate your bringing this forward about how the people do not matter. I live in a different frontline community that's being endangered by the Army Corps of Engineers by wanting to bring the Mississippi River down the industrial canal almost to the level of Lake Pontchartrain. And they simply look at the entire lower Ninth Ward and call it a sacrifice zone, the entire thing. And it's in front of the community, we're doing what we can, but no, it's not like they count how many people are there. They just say, those people didn't care enough to build that anyway. So thank you for bringing this up, because it is St. John, but it is everywhere.
Yeah, it certainly goes beyond St. John, yeah, absolutely.
It is absolutely all of us in the United States and beyond. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Colten. If we can give a round of applause. And I want to thank you all so much for coming here today and sticking out for 4 whole hours. I thought, who's going to stay here for 4 hours with me? But you all did it. We'll be here kind of cleaning up. So if you do have any questions for any of us who put this together, I'm sure people would be happy to answer those questions. Again, books for sale. And please come back and visit Whitney Plantation for a regular tour on one of our regular days. So thank you so much.